was late in the evening in a small town on the edge of the Arizona forest. Two teenagers, Oliver and Mark, stood on the threshold of a dense, dark forest that beckoned them with unknown secrets. For them, it was just an adventure, one of those risky experiments that they later tell their friends about. But this time, the story had a completely different ending. The legend of an old cave hidden deep among the ancient trees haunted them. It was said that this cave could show everyone their greatest fear. The rumors were spreading through the town like a treacherous wind, and it seemed as if the forest itself was whispering this secret to them. That night, they didn't just want to find the cave, they wanted to prove to themselves that they were not afraid of anything. Oliver looked at Mark, who was standing next to him with a tense expression. His friend certainly wasn't going to show fear, even though such a move seemed foolish even to them. Mark frowned, but nodded silently, signaling that he was ready to go on. Together, they took the first step into the forest, abandoned by light, where every sound seemed extremely loud. As they plunged into the darkness, they felt the forest itself grow thicker and colder. The light of their flashlight scattered in the dense fog, making it impossible for them to see beyond a few steps. The trees around them stood like silent giants, watching them from invisible heights. And the deeper they went, the more the atmosphere changed, filled with ancient mystery. Suddenly, an old wooden pillar with symbols carved so long ago that time and nature had taken their toll appeared on their path. The dry leaves crunched under Mark's feet, and both boys stopped. Their faces expressed both curiosity and anxiety, as if the thought of going back had already arisen inside them. But they both knew that to stop now would mean losing the chance to solve the mystery. The forest enveloped the boys in shadows that seemed to absorb every ray of light, leaving only a narrow strip ahead that their flashlights could illuminate. The farther they walked, the thicker the air became, and Oliver could feel his breath turning into cold puffs of steam that quickly melted in the darkness. The boys moved along in silence, sometimes exchanging short phrases to calm themselves. But every step, every sound only increased the tension, as if the forest was watching them. Suddenly, they heard a strange rustling ahead of them, as if someone was sliding on the ground, and they both stopped. Their flashlights swept nervously from side to side, but they still didn't see anything. Oliver took a cautious step forward, and the sound came again. His heart was pounding, and he could feel cold drops of sweat rolling down his spine. Mark, although he seemed to be just as frightened, did not back away. On the contrary, he took a step closer to him, trying not to show his fear. They started moving again, this time walking more carefully, listening to every sound around them. It seemed to them that hundreds of eyes were lurking in the darkness, watching them from the trees and bushes. The darkness became even denser, and the path they had chosen looked almost invisible. It seemed to change direction by itself, leading the boys deeper and deeper into the forest. And then they came across something quite unusual, several large stones stacked in a kind of circle. On the stones were symbols that looked like they had been carved here many centuries ago. It seemed that this place was either sacred to someone or cursed, because everything here was so imbued with an atmosphere of mystery and fear. Oliver, without realizing it, stepped inside the circle, and suddenly felt his heart clench with anxiety. Mark, who was standing a little further away, did not immediately realize what had happened, but when he noticed his friend's gaze, he also felt a strange, subtle coldness that seemed to pierce his heart. It seemed that the place around them was not just old, it was alive. And this life was something different, not something they knew and understood. Something ancient and invisible was looking at them, as if treating them as uninvited guests. They stood in this stone circle, unmoving, as if something was holding them in place. Oliver and Mark didn't say a word, with a tacit agreement between them to remain calm, only emphasizing the fear that was raging inside each of them. But as soon as Mark decided to step out of the circle, a subtle sound echoed somewhere ahead, like the rustling of branches or a whisper they couldn't clearly recognize. At first they thought it was just the wind, but the forest was completely still, and the cold air surrounded them, leaving no hint of movement. Oliver slowly turned his head, looking for the source of the sound, and as the beam of his flashlight slowly made its way through the trees, he noticed something that made him freeze. There, among the dense undergrowth, something seemed to be standing, a barely visible shadow that didn't move, but didn't have a clear shape either. His eyes quickly blurred, and he couldn't be sure if it was reality or a play of light and shadow. "Do you see it?" he whispered to Mark, trying not to give in to the fear that was slowly building inside him. Mark only nodded, barely noticeable, confirming that he too had seen this strange figure among the trees. The boys looked at the place in confusion, but the shadow did not move and seemed to be part of the forest itself. They stood there, holding their breath, as the figure slowly changed shape, turning into something longer and slimmer, like a shadow from a branch or tree trunk. Then it dissolved, leaving behind only a slight rustle, like a distant whisper. The forest seemed to be warning them, showing them that they were not alone. Mark took a step back, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. Oliver noticed his excitement, but he was in no hurry to return himself. He was filled with a strange desire to stay, to find out what it was, even though the anxiety inside him was growing by the second. But Mark grabbed him by the shoulder again, pushing him back onto the trail, and Oliver finally broke down, giving in to this call to common sense. They backed away, continuing deeper into the forest, but now they were constantly looking over their shoulders, as if sensing that something invisible was following them, that more than one eye was watching them. Their shadows looked unusually long, as if something was pulling them out of the trees, and the light of the flashlights only emphasized the terrifying emptiness around them. Every step seemed to bring them closer to something waiting for them in the darkness. Oliver and Mark quickly realized that the forest they had wandered into was far from ordinary. The deeper they went, the more the paths seemed to twist and turn, as if the forest itself were alive, changing shape to keep them from finding a way out. Mark suggested they turn back, but Oliver sighed and nodded, sensing a creeping fear within him. They tried retracing their steps, but each path led to stranger, more unsettling parts of the forest. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking even the faint starlight. Panic began to set in as they felt trapped, walking in circles with no way forward. They moved in silence, trying not to show fear, but Oliver could feel his legs growing heavier, the air thick with an unseen tension, pressing in around him. Suddenly, Mark spotted something ahead, a faint light glimmering through the underbrush. He nudged Oliver, and they both moved toward it, hoping it might lead them out. But as they approached, the light flickered and vanished into the shadows, leaving them with the unnerving sense that something was toying with them, leading them deeper into the woods. In the silence of the dark forest, strange sounds began to follow them, whispers, barely audible footsteps cracking twigs, an eerie rustling that echoed between the trees. The noises grew louder, and Oliver and Mark started to suspect they were no longer alone. They stopped, listening intently, but each time they moved, the sounds crept closer, as if stalking them. Their hearts pounded louder in the stillness, broken only by their heavy breathing. The darkness seemed to grow denser, and then, almost too quietly to be real, they heard their names being whispered. Mark and Oliver exchanged panicked glances, unsure if it was all in their heads, or if someone or something was calling to them from the shadows. Oliver took a step forward, but Mark grabbed his shoulder, halting him. They knew standing still was dangerous, but the fear of what lay ahead kept them rooted in place. Mark suddenly stopped, pointing to something on the ground. There lay a small stone covered in strange symbols. They leaned in for a closer look, and realized it wasn't an ordinary stone. Its surface was etched with markings similar to those they had seen on the stone circle earlier. Mark picked up the stone, tucking it into his pocket. Though they felt an uneasy dread, they continued onward, unaware that this stone would soon become a key to the events that lay ahead. As they continued down the path, Mark suddenly disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as if swallowed by the forest itself. Oliver turned around, but his friend was nowhere to be seen. He called Mark's name, but the only response was silence, the forest absorbing his voice. Panic surged within Oliver, and he began stumbling blindly through the dark, desperately searching for his friend. Left alone in the forest, Oliver's heart raced with fear and desperation. He scanned the ground, hoping for a sign, when he noticed faint footprints on the damp earth, leading deeper into the woods. Moving closer, he saw that the prints were strangely distorted, almost unnatural in shape. A chilling unease prickled down his spine, but the need to find his friend overpowered his fear. Oliver followed the trail, feeling the darkness press closer with each step. The trees seemed to loom around him, and before he realized it, a dark opening appeared in his path, a cave, yawning wide as if it had been carved from pure darkness. He froze, staring into the black entrance, feeling an icy draft seep out from within. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped inside, leaving the forest and its twisted paths behind. As Oliver carefully made his way deeper into the cave, silence pressed in so thick he could hear every breath, every beat of his heart. He stepped forward, watching in horror as the cave walls seemed to shift, shadows taking shape to reveal his darkest fears. Shadows of people stretched out toward him, their hands reaching, mouths moving in muted cries as if calling him from another world. Oliver felt panic grip him, compelling him to flee, but something unseen held him in place, drawing him further in. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of him and Mark, but with a face contorted and empty eyes that seemed not to see. "Mark?" Oliver whispered, but the figure only wavered and vanished back into shadow. Oliver realized these visions were part of something ancient, something malevolent that had been waiting here all along. A cold tremor passed through Oliver as Mark reappeared before him, but he looked different. He stood motionless in the dark, face void of expression, staring directly at Oliver. "Mark, is that you?" Oliver whispered, but there was no reply. Mark approached slowly, his eyes an inky black, his movements strange and stiff, as though controlled by unseen strings. Oliver took a step back, realizing that whatever was in front of him was no longer his friend. "He shouldn't have come here," Mark said in a voice not his own. Oliver felt his heart turn to ice as the truth sank in. Fear gripped Oliver, as he finally understood Mark was no longer himself. He had become part of the forest's dark essence. This place wasn't just a trap, it was a consuming force, one that lured in those who sought its secrets. Oliver tried to scream, but terror had stolen his voice. He took another step back, realizing he had to escape before the forest claimed him too. Mark remained unmoving, as if rooted to the ground, his eyes fixed in a dead stare. The forest had found its next inhabitant, and Oliver feared he would be next. Oliver turned and ran from the cave, knowing his only hope was to escape this cursed place. He sprinted through the dark forest, not daring to look back, but an unseen presence followed close, refusing to let him go. The forest grew darker still, twisted branches reaching out like claws. A cold touch grazed his shoulder, and he spun around, only to find nothing but shadows. The silence closed in, broken only by a faint, ghostly whisper that echoed his name. Finally, he broke through the forest's edge, collapsing on the open ground beyond. He had survived, but he knew the horror he had experienced would never truly leave him.